The West was a land that never forgave weakness. The wind tore through the plains like a blade, and the dust itself seemed to carry stories of men who bled, healed, or died beneath the sun. Out there, pain wasn't a tragedy. It was a teacher. And every cowboy learned his lesson the hard way. They didn't have doctors, not real ones. Maybe a traveling surgeon if the railroad passed close, or a whiskey-soaked sawbones who'd been a Civil War medic before drifting west with a bag full of rusted tools. But most of the time, when a young cowboy took a bullet, there were only two medicines that mattered: courage and whiskey. It wasn't the bullets that killed most men, it was what came after: infection, fever, blood loss. A single wound could turn a hero into a corpse by morning, but somehow many lived. Somehow they dragged themselves out of the dirt and back onto their saddles, patching their bodies with the same grit they used to break wild horses. The stories aren't told in the textbooks. They lived in whispers by campfires, men with scars like constellations across their skin, each one a mark of defiance. Take Tommy Red Callahan, barely 19 when he rode with a cattle crew up the Chisholm Trail. A boy with freckles, a Colt revolver too big for his hand, and a smile that made danger look like a game. One night, under a sky split by lightning, the herd spooked, thunder rolling, hooves pounding like drums. Red tried to calm them, but from the darkness came another sound: gunfire, rustlers. The chaos lasted seconds. When it ended, Red lay face down in the mud, blood soaking through his shirt. A .44 slug had torn through his shoulder. The others found him hours later, pale, shaking, teeth clenched against the pain. No doctor, no antiseptic, just the wide, merciless night. They carried him to camp, where Doc Avery, a former army surgeon who'd traded battlefields for cattle trails, did what he could. His tools were primitive: a pocket knife, a flask of whiskey, and a branding iron. He cleaned the wound with the liquor, told Red to bite down on a piece of rawhide, and pressed the hot iron into the torn flesh to cauterize it. The scream echoed into the prairie, mingling with the cry of coyotes. But Red lived. For days he drifted between fever and consciousness, his friends forcing him to drink broth and water, praying the infection wouldn't take hold. He'd wake sometimes muttering about home, about his mother's kitchen, about the smell of biscuits baking. Then he'd shiver and fade again. There were no antibiotics, no morphine, but what they could steal from old battlefield kits. Men learned to make their own medicine: willow bark for pain, tobacco poultices for infection, spider webs pressed into wounds to stop the bleeding. It wasn't science, it was desperation turned into survival. And when the fever broke, if it broke, they'd wrap the wound with strips of shirt or saddlecloth and get back in the saddle. Because out there, time didn't wait for healing. Red carried that scar the rest of his life, a puckered brand of fire across his shoulder. Every time the rain came, he said he could feel the iron again. But he kept riding. That's what cowboys did. They didn't heal, they hardened. Still, not all were so lucky. Some bled out before help arrived. Others lived long enough to die slow, feverish deaths that smelled of rot. The plains were a graveyard of the tough and the unlucky, and every town had its own burial hill where wooden crosses leaned in the wind. But the ones who survived, they became something else. They learned tricks no school could teach. They carried needles and thread in their saddlebags, not for clothes but for flesh. They boiled their knives before cutting lead from wounds. They learned to tell the difference between pain that could be endured and pain that meant the end. Even the way they fought changed because of it. Cowboys learned not to waste bullets, because a wound didn't mean death, but it meant agony. They knew that even if you dropped your enemy, he might crawl off and die days later, and you might follow from the same infection. Gunfights weren't about glory. They were about timing, distance, and fear. There's a story about Jed Hawthorne, a drifter who'd been shot through the thigh in a saloon brawl. The bullet missed the bone but tore the artery. He knew it right away. The way the blood pulse told him death was coming fast. No doctor, no bandage, but his own shirt. He grabbed his belt, wrapped it around his leg, and pulled tight. The pain was enough to make him black out, but he held on. Then, with trembling hands, he heated his knife in a lantern flame and dug for the bullet himself. The others in the saloon watched, pale and silent, as he worked, sweat dripping, blood pooling. When he found the lead, he dropped it into his whiskey glass and pressed the hot blade into the wound to seal it. He lived. Limped for the rest of his days, but lived. Men like Jed and Red became legends, not because they were fast with a gun, but because they were faster than death. They understood what it meant to refuse to die. Still, every victory came with a cost. Fingers lost to infection, limbs amputated with rusty saws, faces scarred beyond recognition. And yet, they kept coming. Young men riding west with nothing but a dream and a revolver, thinking courage could beat death. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. They'd bury their friends in shallow graves, mark the spot with a boot heel and ride on. Because in the Old West, grief was a luxury. The trail didn't stop for mourning. But those scars, those stories, they became part of the myth. The way the cowboys carried themselves, quiet and deliberate, came from knowing how close death always rode. Every sunrise was a borrowed miracle. Every drink at the saloon a celebration of one more day survived. And as the years passed, those who'd lived through it carried the lessons in silence. They became the old men on porches, staring into the sunset, rolling cigarette paper with fingers twisted by old wounds. When they spoke, it was soft, like the desert wind. "You don't fight to win," they'd say. "You fight to live long enough to heal. And if you did heal, it wasn't because you were lucky. It was because you were too damn stubborn to die." Out on the frontier, pain became a language every man learned to speak. It hummed beneath their skin like an old tune, constant, haunting, and familiar. The young ones came out wide-eyed and eager, chasing stories of quick fame and fast guns, but they learned soon enough that the West didn't forgive mistakes. A single bullet could change everything, not just whether you lived, but how you lived after. There was no hospital waiting beyond the next ridge, no nurse with clean hands. There was just the wind, the dust, and whatever grit you could scrape together. A cowboy's body was his own battlefield, and survival depended on how much pain he could carry before the light went out. They had tricks, rough, primitive things passed down from soldiers and drifters, from Mexican vaqueros and native healers who understood the land better than any textbook could. A strip of horsehair made a fine suture if you boiled it first. Whiskey worked for cleaning wounds, but so did urine when whiskey ran dry. Spider webs stopped bleeding. Pine sap sealed cuts. And every man knew the sound, that sharp, wet hiss, when infection started to take hold beneath the skin. In those days, a bullet wound was just the start of a long, miserable dance. The bullet itself wasn't the worst of it. The dirt was. Black powder left burns that festered, and the guns themselves were filthy, handled with hands that hadn't seen soap in weeks. Cowboys learned to dig deep into flesh with their own knives, to find that small, hot lump of lead before it killed them. If you couldn't find it, you prayed it would stay still inside you. Some men carried bullets for the rest of their lives, lodged in muscle or bone, reminders of every time death came close enough to touch. Sometimes, when the wound was too deep or too ugly, they'd find a ranch cook or a midwife, someone who'd seen blood before. These women were the real healers of the West. They didn't wear white coats or carry stethoscopes. They wore aprons and smelled of sage. They boiled rags in iron pots, ground herbs with the same hands that kneaded dough, and whispered prayers over the broken men they patched together. One such woman was Clara Dunn, known from Dodge City to Santa Fe as the Angel with Whiskey Hands. She'd been a widow of the war, married young to a Confederate soldier who never came back. She learned medicine from the dead, from watching them go, from trying to keep others from following. When gunfighters came crawling to her door, she didn't ask names. She asked how bad it was. Then she'd pour whiskey down their throats, dig out the lead and sew them shut by lamplight. Sometimes they lived, sometimes they didn't. Either way, she kept their guns as payment. By the time she died, her wall was a museum of other men's sins. But even the toughest cowboys feared one thing above all, the green sickness. Gangrene. You could smell it before you saw it. Flesh that turned black and soft, the stink thick and sweet in the air. Once it started, there was only one cure, the saw. That's when courage met its true test. Out there, amputations weren't done in clean rooms. They were done on kitchen tables, on bar counters, on the cold dirt floor of a barn. A belt in the mouth, a bottle in hand. A friend holding you down while another man cut. They said you could hear the screaming for miles. And yet, Some survived even that. There was Luke Barnett, shot through the arm during a poker fight in Abilene. Infection set in fast, turning his skin black within days. Clara did what she had to do. She cut the arm above the elbow, stitched him up, and told him to pray. He did more than pray. He learned to shoot with his left hand. Within a year, he was faster than before. He became a legend, one-armed Luke, the man who could draw, fire, and reload with a single arm faster than most men could blink. That was the strange thing about those times. Suffering didn't just break men, sometimes it rebuilt them. Every scar became a story, every missing piece a badge of survival. When the winter nights grew long and the whiskey low, the cowboys would gather around the fire, trading tales of pain like old war veterans. They'd show off scars, laugh through the memory of agony, and remind themselves, and each other, that they were still here. A man might pull up his sleeve and point. "Right there," he'd say, "Rustler in Laredo. Doc used a branding iron and a prayer." Another would grin through his cracked teeth. "You think that's bad? I got gut shot once, drank half a bottle of rot gut, and pulled the slug out with tongs." They laughed because the alternative was to cry. And beneath the laughter, there was something deeper, a quiet reverence for the human will, for the stubborn, reckless courage it took to stay alive in a world that didn't care if you did. Some even carried their own little medicine kits, not because they trusted doctors, but because they didn't trust fate. A tin box with a needle, thread, a flask, and maybe a bit of morphine if they could get it. They became their own surgeons, their own saviors. Still, death was never far. You could patch a wound, but you couldn't always outrun infection. When fever came, it burned through men like wildfire. They'd shake and sweat, whispering to ghosts that no one else could see. Some survived through sheer will. Others just faded into the night, buried in shallow graves marked by their hat and boots. The survivors learned to live with ghosts. They rode again, carrying pain in their bones, scars that split open in the rain, and memories that haunted every empty dawn. But that was the price of the frontier. To live meant to lose something of yourself, one piece at a time. Even the young ones who made it to old age didn't talk much about the pain. They'd sit on porches with tobacco-stained lips, staring off toward the endless plains. And when some curious kid asked, "Did it hurt, mister?" they'd just smile that thin, knowing smile and say, "Son, everything hurt back then." That's how you knew you were alive. Out there, the line between life and death was as thin as a knife's edge, and the cowboys balanced on it every single day. They didn't survive because of medicine. They survived because of something no doctor could bottle, sheer bull-headed defiance. The kind that made a man spit blood, pull himself to his feet and say, "Ain't dead yet." And in the wild, merciless silence of the frontier, sometimes that was enough. Out there on the endless frontier, time slowed down when a man was wounded. The world shrank to the sound of his heartbeat and the rattle of his own breath. Every tick of pain felt like a verdict from God. Some men cursed heaven, some begged it, but all of them learned the same truth. You didn't survive a gunfight because you were lucky. You survived because you were mean enough to outlive the pain. The silence after the shooting was the worst part. The way the world went quiet, as if it were listening to see who'd lived long enough to tell the tale. Cowboys bled into the dirt, while the wind whispered through the grass, and their friends, or enemies depending on the day, gathered around trying to decide what to do. Sometimes mercy meant ending it quick. Other times it meant fighting for hours to keep a dying man breathing. There was no uniform code, no medical oath, only the bond of those who knew that tomorrow, at sunrise, didn't belong to everyone. Take Eli Monroe, for instance, 19, a ranch hand turned gunslinger by circumstance. He'd been fast on the draw, but not fast enough. A bullet caught him low in the gut, the kind of wound everyone knew was a death sentence. Gut shots were cruel. They didn't kill quick. They killed slow, burning a man alive from the inside. The others dragged him into a barn outside Amarillo, lit one lantern and waited. The air smelled of hay and blood. Eli moaned, clutching his stomach, whispering the same words over and over, "Don't let me die yet." His partner Sam didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. There wasn't a doctor within 50 miles, and even if there was, nothing could be done. The bullet had opened him up like a river. So they did what men always did, poured whiskey on the wound, wrapped it in rags, and prayed. For 3 days, Eli lingered. Fever, sweat, shaking. Every few hours he'd come back to himself, his young face pale as moonlight. "Sam," he whispered once, "you think God forgives boys like us?" Sam said yes, but his voice broke when he said it. By dawn of the fourth day, Eli was gone. They buried him out behind the barn, boots off, hat over his chest, and rode on. That's how it was. The living didn't have time to stop for the dead. But sometimes a miracle happened. Sometimes a man refused to die, even when the world decided he should. A cowboy named Matthew Crow had taken a shot clean through his lung during a cattle drive ambush. The others said he was done for. No one breathes after a hole like that. But he crawled to the river, washed the wound, and lay in the cold water for hours until the bleeding slowed. Then he stuffed the hole with chewed tobacco leaves, bound it with a strip of his saddlebag, and rode 70 miles to the next town, half delirious. He lived. Lived another 30 years, they said, though he never took a deep breath again. Every inhale rattled like a broken gate in the wind, but it was enough. That's what survival looked like in the West. Not clean, not heroic, but stubborn. Pain was constant. Infection was a shadow that followed every wound. So they learned to listen to their bodies the way they listened to their horses or the wind. A chill meant fever. A trembling hand meant blood loss. A smell, sweet and rotten, meant time was running out. Some turned to old remedies from the people who had been on the land long before the cowboys came. Native healers used roots and barks, smoke and ritual. They'd pack wounds with crushed yarrow, wash burns with sage water, sing prayers that vibrated through the bones. The cowboys didn't always understand it, but they respected it, because sometimes it worked. They'd sit around fires, half drunk, half healed, and speak of men who had cool the touch, those rare souls who could bring someone back from the edge. One name that always came up was Doc Hollis, a half Cherokee, half Irish wanderer who carried nothing but a saddlebag and a book of old remedies. He'd appear in a town after a gunfight like a spirit, fix what could be fixed, bury what couldn't, and vanish by sunrise. He used herbs most men couldn't name, whispered to the fevered like he was negotiating with death itself. Nobody knew where he came from, but they said his hands never shook even when holding a red-hot knife. He treated cowboys, lawmen, outlaws, and it didn't matter. To Doc Hollis, blood was just blood. There's a story that once he stitched up a man who had been shot 5 times and left for dead near Santa Fe. When the man woke, he asked, "Why'd you save me?" Doc just smiled. "Wasn't your time," he said. "When it is, you'll know. You'll stop fightin'." That was the secret, really. Fight. Every man who survived long enough to grow old in the West had one thing in common. They never stopped fighting. Even when their bodies gave out, their minds refused. Sometimes that willpower made the difference between life and death. A man could keep his heart beating by sheer stubbornness, by the promise of unfinished business, or a name to avenge. The West was full of men held together not by sinew and bone, but by purpose. Still, the scars never faded. Not just the ones on their bodies, the ones behind their eyes. The nightmares, the phantom pain, the memory of screams in the night. They'd flinch at the sound of fireworks, go quiet when someone slammed a door. They carried the smell of gunpowder in their dreams, the echo of dying breaths that no whiskey could drown. And yet they rode on, because that's what cowboys did. They rode through the ache, through the loneliness, through the endless horizon that offered no peace. They lived in a world that gave nothing freely, not life, not mercy, not rest. So they took what they could, one heartbeat at a time. When they healed, they didn't celebrate. They saddled up and rode back into danger because that's all they knew. There was no retirement, no after. The West didn't let go. And on the nights when the pain in their scars grew too heavy, they'd look at the sky wide and endless and whisper to the stars like old friends. "Guess I ain't dead yet," they'd say, and that was victory enough. On the frontier, healing wasn't a process. It was a gamble. You never knew if the wound that stopped bleeding today would rot tomorrow. You never knew if the fever meant your body was fighting or surrendering. There were no antiseptics, no sterile bandages, no guarantees. Only the long, slow ache that came after the fight, when the adrenaline was gone and the silence pressed heavy on your chest. That's when most men broke, not in battle but in the quiet that followed. Those who made it through learned patience the hard way. The days blurred together. The smell of sweat and dust, the sting of flies on fresh scars, the taste of metal in your mouth from the blood that never quite left your tongue. They learned to sit still when sitting felt like dying, to watch the sun rise and set from the same cot, waiting for the pain to dull. Every wound became a kind of teacher. Every scar was a lesson carved in flesh, and those who lived long enough to collect them became walking testaments to what the human spirit could endure. A cowboy named Sam Grady once said, "You ain't really a man till you've had to sew yourself shut." He wasn't joking. Sam had done it twice, once after taking a knife to the ribs in a saloon fight, and again after being grazed by a bullet near the Pecos. He used fishing line and a sewing needle from his saddlebag, his hands shaking so bad he left crooked stitches. But the wound closed. He lived. And every time someone asked how, he'd just grin and say, "Didn't figure I had permission to die yet." That was the heart of it, the refusal. The frontier didn't breed strength as much as it bred stubbornness. Pain became something to outlast, not avoid. When a man could barely walk, he crawled. When he couldn't crawl, he cursed the earth and waited until he could stand again. And if he couldn't stand, well, he made sure his pistol was close enough that no one else would finish the job for him. Sometimes the only medicine was the promise of revenge. The thought of finding the man who pulled the trigger kept more cowboys alive than any poultice or tonic ever did. But even those who survived weren't the same afterward. Once you'd been shot, or burned, or cut deep enough to see bone, the world changed. You stopped believing in immortality. You learned that the body was fragile and the soul was restless. You started noticing small things, the way your hand trembled when you reloaded, the way your breathing caught on cold mornings, the way thunder made your heart race like gunfire again. They didn't call it trauma back then. They called it nerves. And the cure was simple: keep moving. So they did. Cowboys with half-healed wounds climbed back into the saddle, tied bandanas around their arms to keep the dust out of open flesh, and rode on as if nothing had happened. They told themselves that motion was healing, that forward meant alive. Every mile put distance between them and the memory of bleeding. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. There were nights when even the strongest among them would wake screaming, clutching their sides where phantom bullets still burned. They'd light a cigarette, pour a drink, and stare into the flames until the shaking stopped. No doctor, no priest, just the fire, the smoke, and the whisper of old ghosts. And yet, in that raw, godless silence, they found something close to peace. Because when you've seen death up close, when you've felt it breathing against your neck and somehow walked away, you stop fearing it. The cowboys didn't worship survival. They respected it. It was a fragile, temporary thing to be honored while it lasted. Maybe that's why they laughed so loud, drank so hard, lived so fast, because they knew what it meant to lose a heartbeat and to earn it back the hard way. Years later, when the railroads came and doctors started carrying clean instruments and glass bottles of medicine, the old ones didn't trust it. They'd shake their heads at the fancy words, chloroform, antiseptic, anesthesia, and mutter, "Hell, we may do with whiskey and grit." And maybe they were right, because what those men had wasn't just pain tolerance, it was belief. Belief that you could suffer and still rise. Belief that if you breathed one more time, maybe you'd get to see another sunrise over the desert. It wasn't science that saved them, it was will. They knew how to read their bodies the way they read the land. The color of a wound, the heat of a fever, the weight of exhaustion. They knew when to rest, when to ride, when to cut, when to pray, and when to stop. That instinct, that ancient unspoken knowledge, was the real medicine of the West. There was an old cowboy in his 60s named Thomas Lyle who'd been shot 3 times before he was 25. Lost a finger, half his hearing, and 1 lung. Still rode cattle well into his old age. Folks asked him how he managed to live so long. He'd smile, spit tobacco, and say, "Reckon the bullets missed the part of me that mattered." Maybe that was true for all of them. When the next generation came, the railroad men, the settlers, the young ones who had never fired a gun in anger, the old cowboys watched them with quiet amusement. They saw soft hands and clean shirts, and maybe they felt a little sorry. Those boys would never know what it was like to wake up half dead and still ride 100 miles just to prove you could. They'd never know what it meant to survive without hope, only stubbornness. And when the old-timers finally passed, their graves were simple, Wooden crosses, sometimes no names at all, but their stories lived on, in saloons, in songs, in the whispers around campfires where new generations still talked about them, because the legend of the cowboy wasn't built on victory, it was built on endurance. The men who refused to die became myths, and those myths became America's spine, tough, scarred, and unbreakable. So when you hear the word cowboy, remember what it really meant. Not a man with a clean hat and a silver revolver, but a boy, young, bleeding, terrified, using a dirty knife to pull a bullet from his flesh, whispering through gritted teeth, "Not yet." That was the heartbeat of the West. It was pain turned into perseverance, blood turned into story, and death turned into legend, because out there under that endless sky, no one waited for miracles. They made their own.